Hi, Janeites, and welcome back to the What the Austen podcast. I am back. I know it was a little bit up in the air whether or not I'd come back for 2025 and also the 250th anniversary year, but alas, here I am. I could not give it up. We are back, and I've got so many exciting guests lined up for this year, so I'm really excited to be doing this. It is possible this will be the last season, so I really hope that it's going to be an amazing celebration both of Austen, the podcast, and just everyone that I've spoken to over the last few years. So yeah, welcome to the 250th anniversary year of Jane Austen, and welcome to the What the Austen podcast. So our first guest lined up for today is going to be the author Jessica Bull. So Jessica kicked off last year's season, and now she's kicking off this year's season because her second book of the Miss Austen Investigates series is out, A Fortune Most Fatal. A fabulous book. I read it in 24 hours, really loved it. Jessica is a fabulous author and just a wonderful person as well. So I'm really excited to chat to her today. So yeah, let's get into the episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Jess. I am so happy to have you on again. And I'm so happy that you're the first person back again. So last year you kicked off the podcast season and you're doing it again this year. So by this point, it's a tradition, I'm thinking.
Amazing. Absolutely. I'll see you back here next year, is it?
Oh gosh, don't say that, because I'm not sure if I'm going to be coming back next year. But, you know, even if this is the last...
we need you.
Yeah. I'll just come back for you, Jess, just for the one. Oh dear. But today what we're going to chat about is Jess's new book. I told you that I made all my notes, like, because I always make notes in the book so that I know that they're where they are. So this is like in the book, all of my thoughts. A special year for this to come out, Jess, with the 250th anniversary.
I know, it's so exciting. There's so many things happening. I'm so excited about it. And I can't believe that I've managed to get 2 books out ready to celebrate with everyone.
I know. Honestly, it's so impressive, because I remember last time when we were chatting, because you already had this written, right? And you were in the editing process.
I've been waiting for this moment. I've been wondering all these years, the last few years, when I think I realised it was the 250 coming up. And I was wondering, like, you know, was it just me that was going to be super excited about that? But obviously now I'm totally immersed in the Jane Austen community and everybody is going mad for it. So it's a brilliant moment to share with everyone.
100%. It has been so exciting so far, and we're only like 2 months in. So I'm really hopeful that the whole year is going to look this way, and it's going to be a lot of fun for everyone. So I thought what we could do is we could chat about just in general, like a bit of a synopsis around the book. Something that I love about both your books and just the way that you write. I think I mentioned this to you when I finished reading it, but that's like the consistency to your characters. So both to Jane, who obviously we follow through the series, but then also to the other characters that live within their own book. So all the way through, they're just so true to themselves. And it's so strange, because obviously they have the essence of who they were as historical figures, like who they were in the past, like what we get from the letters and then from memoirs and things. But on top of that, you can also tell that they're fictional, and there's a beauty in that, but there is such this consistency, and like, yeah, you managed to get that balance so well, and I love that. So I don't know if you want to give like a quick summary of what is covered in this book.
Sure. Oh, Betty, that's lovely to hear. I think that I've spent so long kind of researching the Austen family and thinking about what they might have been like, that they're completely real to me in my head. They're just sort of turning to old friends, and when I try and write them, they just sort of chatter away to me. And I think, you know, what would they do in this situation? And it's not like I make it up, it's like they tell me. So yeah, it's a real pleasure having so many resources to draw from on them. So this book, A Fortune Most Fatal, is the second in the Miss Austen Investigates series. And in this one, she goes down to Kent to look after her wealthy brother Neddy's children for the summer. So as you might know, Neddy was adopted by the Austen's cousins, and was in line to inherit a great fortune from them. And she goes down to Kent ostensibly to look after his children for the summer. Cassandra can't do it because she's grieving the loss of her fiancé, Tom Fowl. But when Jane gets down there, she realises that her time will be better spent investigating the mysterious young woman who's claiming to be a shipwrecked foreign princess and residing with Mrs. Knight, that's Neddy's adoptive mother, before she swans off with the fortune that all of the Austens have come to rely on. So it's very much inspired by the kind of real life dilemmas. And I think the fun part of it was exploring that class difference between Austen herself and her wider family that allowed her, I think, to write her novels because of Neddy's adoption, she was brought into contact with all these like hugely wealthy people who lived in these great country houses, and she really got to observe that way of life. But she wasn't really part of it herself. She was always on the fringes as a woman and as a relatively poor woman for her class. So she wasn't poor. She was a daughter of a clergyman, but she didn't have like an independent fortune or much of an independent source of income for most of her life. So she was very much an outsider looking in, and that's what she brings, I think, so wonderfully to her novels that we can all relate to, even if we're not in that exact position. So everybody who is on the fringes of their society or has ever felt oppressed by their society or excluded from it can relate to Austen, even if it's not exactly the same scenario.
100%. And unfortunately, just with how things are at the moment, I know for me, and I think for a lot of people, it is becoming quite difficult to live at the moment. Like prices are going up of everything. Our wages are, for a lot of people, increasing, but not enough to keep up with inflation. So I think there is something even more relatable at the
Yeah,
moment about Austen's situation, and just
yeah.
that kind of fear around being able to take care of yourself and the people that you love as well. Because a lot of the times it's not just about our own situation, our own journey. A lot of us do, want the best for our friends and family as well. So I think there's
Hmm.
something beautiful in that as well, that Austen, I think you can really tell in all of her letters and everything that she wrote, that she was so family focused. And I feel like that's really picked up in this book in particular, that you kind of focus on even her relationship with the Knights, right? And obviously,
Yeah.
Neddy, like you said, he was adopted, so he wasn't
Hmm.
living in the Austen household. So
Hmm.
they didn't have the same bond as, say, Henry and Jane would have had, or
No.
Cassandra and Jane. So yeah, I think it's lovely that you do focus on that too, and that she still has this loyalty to a family member
Hmm.
who obviously she didn't spend that much time with in general.
Yeah, and it really shines through in the letters, and it's kind of the same with all of her brothers. So, like in the first book, we looked at how when they were very young, all of the children were kind of fostered out by a dry nurse in the village, and then they come home. But by that time, because they're a big family, and some of the brothers are quite a lot older than her. By the time she comes home, there's only like a couple of years before they start to go away again. And she went to school herself at only 7 and 9. Cassandra and her went to school. So the actual time they spend living in the same house together, as the kind of family that we envisage these days, wasn't very long. But the lengths that they all go to keep in touch. So even when the Sailor brothers are the other side of the world and they're writing home, and Edward definitely, although he had this new family in Kent, he was always kind of writing home and thinking about his family, and they were always doing things like, sending him things down, and he was sending things back all the way from Kent to Hampshire. And the Austen girls, Cassandra and Jane, were always like traveling that route from Hampshire through London to Kent to see with that family, to be used as free childcare, I must add. But yeah, what you get is a really strong sense of a family that, loves each other. They're not perfect. They're not like the Brady Bunch. They don't always get along. There's some tension there, but there's a real effort to keep in touch and to support each other.
Absolutely, and that does really shine through in your book. So I'd love to talk a little bit about the research that you had to do for this. Then I know you said that obviously you've spent so much time researching it anyway, that these, the people in Austen's life kind of feel like they're, in your head permanently anyway. But it'd be good to talk about the research around the Knights, Godmersham Park, Elizabeth, just all of it really, because I feel like there's maybe some things that happened in terms of obviously Neddy being adopted, but then with his own family. And I believe that Elizabeth even lost her life, right, to childbirth. So there's
Yeah.
like quite a lot around that I love to discuss.
Yeah. So firstly, it was enormous fun researching this book. So I couldn't have written it without the work of Deirdre LaFay, who was a historian who collected all Jane Austen's letters. So I think everybody's probably most familiar with that beautiful book. This one, you can see it's absolutely like crammed with post-it notes of things that I don't know what they refer to. I think I started off with a colour codes, but I don't know now. But she's also wrote some others where she basically collected all of the writing of the wider Austen family. So even the generations that came before, and all of the family lore, so like stories about Jane, and put them together, so I could get a real good sense of Edward and the Knight family from that. And I had some lovely days out visiting the locations in this book. So Goodnestone Park. So Neddy married the daughter of a baronet. And their home is Goodnestone Park, which is a beautiful, like, it's just straight out of a BBC adaptation, a beautiful country house. And actually, Jane visited that just before she started writing Pride and Prejudice. And some people think, oh, maybe it's the real Pemberley, but actually I think it's the real Rosings, because it's in Kent and the house is separated from the church by a small country lane. And she did, I know, right? And she did have a bit of a flirtation with Elizabeth, so that's her sister-in-law's younger brother, Edward Bridges, who is very much in her love interest in this book. So in real life, they had a bit of a flirtation. And later on, her letters suggest that he asked her to marry him. But by that time, I know, right? And he was really nice. You can tell she likes him from the way she talks about him. So there's a really sweet letter where she says that they had the house to themselves because she was staying there and he was there, and he orders toasted cheese for supper, especially for her. That's the kind of man you want, right? So he's so,
Absolutely.
I know, he's so lovely. But by the time he asked her to marry him, Edward had already given them the house in Chawton, and she, I think, had decided to dedicate her life to writing. So there's a letter to Cassandra where she says that she can't accept his invitation. I know, he's just one of the many men who were, queuing up to marry Jane Austen. So Goodnestone Park and Gardens is lovely because you can visit. You can hire the place for a wedding if you're fancy enough, but you can go and walk around the grounds and have tea in the lovely tea shop. Godmersham Park, which is the house that the Knights bequeathed to Edward, is a beautiful mansion, and you'll be familiar with it because it's behind Jane on the back of your £10 note, so you can have a look at it there. That one's harder to get into, and I never managed to get inside, but I did manage to go to the grounds because they open it once a year for the National Gardening Scheme, and I'm a mad keen gardener. So I found out about it through that and went, and it's incredible. And there's also a really beautiful heritage centre, and in that's like really dedicated to the history of the place and the connection with Austen. And through that, I managed to get quite a lot of photographs of what it was like inside. So really threw myself into the work then. And then the other place that was really helpful was Chawton House in Hampshire, because that was owned by the Knights. And Neddy was adopted. So basically what happened was his cousins, Thomas Knight II and Mrs. Knight, married, and she was quite a lot younger than him, and they came to Hampshire as part of their bridal tour when Neddy was about 11, and they took a shine to him, so much so that they took him with him on their honeymoon.
My goodness.
Fancy taking an 11-year-old boy on your honeymoon. But that was the sort of thing that the Georgians did. I mean, you can see it in her novels, like, in Pride and Prejudice, the gardeners take, like Jane off to London, they take Lizzie off to the Derbyshire. So they took Neddy off with them, and they were fabulously wealthy. They kept kind of inheriting. And so they go off on this bridal tour, and then they keep in touch. And then I think pretty soon they decide or realise that they're not going to have children of their own, and they start inviting Neddy for long stays at Godmersham. And then eventually, when he's about 14, he goes to live with them for good, and they do the paperwork, and he's officially adopted by them. And the legend is that his father said, kind of balked at the idea of officially giving his son up for adoption. But the Austen mum said, Mrs. Austen said, I think, my dear, you'd better let the child go. because she could see that the future was for him, was there. It was a wonderful future. And if you compare it to Jane's other brothers, I mean, they didn't have that kind of fortune. So both Frank and Charles went to Portsmouth Naval Academy at 11 and 12, and then were off sailing around the world at 14, in the wars. So it's a really shrewd decision. And it paid off for the Austen family. And it's very strange to our ears to think you could willingly give up your child for adoption, but absolutely worked out for Neddy.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the thing. You can't underestimate how hard a decision that may have been. I think sometimes this is the issue with the letters, right? Is sometimes we can um some decisions or things that are said
Mm.
can feel very flippant, that it's just like, oh, this
Yeah,
is an okay
yeah,
situation, but you
yeah,
don't know the full depths of like the emotion that
yeah,
went around that, the other discussions. You only kind of have what's
yeah.
in snippets. So
Yeah, and if you put it into perspective of the other brothers, so I think James went to, I mean, he wasn't adopted as a baby. He was, 11 by the time he first met them. Um, and if you put it into perspective of the other brothers, and even Jane and Cassandra, the Georgians outsourced child rearing. They didn't, cling on to their children in the same way that we do. And, a child without an inheritance by 11 or 12 would be thinking, of all classes, would be thinking, what kind of a profession am I going to get into in order to support me? And that he was handed the most, wonderful um, profession that he could have, which was a landed gentleman. And I think it brings in like 8,000 a year, Godmersham, which is, somewhere between Bingley and Darcy, isn't it? So I
yeah,
mean,
not too
he's got nothing to
shabby.
complain. No, not too shabby, not too shabby. But Austen is sharp about it. And there's a bit in Mansfield Park when Fanny goes to stay with her wider family, where Austen actually writes, like, what kind of unnatural mother could give up her child in that way, even though it's obviously like in the same scenario, it's the best possible outcome for Fanny. She's going to get an education. She's going to get a chance to mix with wealthier people. She might make a future for herself. But can you imagine Austen's mum reading that and thinking, well,
This is what I
I
love
gave
about
your
Austen.
brother
She
up.
does not take herself too seriously, does she? Like, nobody was safe when it came to
No,
Austen and the pen.
no,
Like,
no, no, no. She's so sharp. You can like feel her like pen nib cutting through the paper. She is so sharp.
oh my
Yeah,
goodness, that's so funny. I think a difference as well, maybe something that we've lost slightly over time, is you would have raised your children more in a community sense as well.
yeah,
Like you said, there would
yeah,
have been a lot of people like helping out, doing childcare, and
yeah,
um, so I think that itself would be different too. Like you would have relied on other people in your towns and villages to help look after your
yeah,
family. So
yeah,
maybe there's something actually really nice in it, that there
yeah.
is, people coming together to help raise the next generation, I suppose.
Yeah. And if you
Um,
think about like working class children, I mean, they would have been in service and, like sent off and apprenticed out. So yeah, Neddie's got no reason to feel sorry for himself.
no, and also at the same time, we probably owe a lot to the Knights in the sense that we probably wouldn't have so many of Austen's books available to us if it wasn't for
Yeah.
them.
We owe them a huge debt of gratitude because, through them, like Neddie was able to support her in those later years and, gift the Austen. It took him a while. Took him a while, must say it took him a while, but eventually he came up with the offer of Chawton Cottage, where Austen was able to devote her life to writing. And Mrs. Knight herself is a really interesting person. So there are two Mrs. Knights who kind of inspired Mrs. Knight in my book. So there's a legend about an older Mrs. Knight, so generations above. So the reason that Edward had to change his name from Edward Austen to Edward Knight wasn't really the decision of the Knights, and in fact they had changed their name to Knight as well. What it was to be the Squire of Chawton in Hampshire, you have to bear the surname Knight, and you have to pass that on to your children. So it's only when Neddie's adoptive parents both die that he assumes the name of Knight and gives up being an Austen. And so there, like a couple of generations above, what had happened was there was a family where the two brothers both died, and there was a sister left. And rather than pass the estate on to wider cousins, she decided what she was going to do was make her husband take the name of Knight, and then she would be the squire of Chawton. And she was a real formidable woman. And there's this really funny story about there was a storm, and the timber kind of falls down over the other side of her wall. And she, because timber was a really valuable resource, so like she talks to her kind of landscapers and said, you know, you better go and get that before the farmer next door gets a hold of it, because it's my timber. And if he dares touch it, he's going to be in trouble. So that obviously fed in, and she allegedly was perhaps the inspiration for Lady Catherine de Bourgh, who, is another formidable woman who will not bow down to the male property rights, and is insistent that she's going to pass her estate on to her daughter down the female line. So there was her, but then there's also the Mrs. Knight who adopted Neddy, was a particular friend of Jane Austen, and in her letters you can see how much she enjoys visiting her, and she actually became her patron. So she talked to Mrs. Knight about books. Mrs. Knight would loan her books, and there's a letter where she talks about Mrs. Knight gives her her usual fee and all her usual kindness. So as far as we know, she's the only one who supported Jane Austen to write financially during her lifetime. And there's hints that she might have contributed to the publishing of Sense and Sensibility as well, which of course was Jane Austen's first published novel. And she published in a kind of hybrid self-publishing way where they funded the production of it. And we know that because she tells us that Mrs. Knight is anxiously waiting for her copy of Sense and Sensibility. Jane is giving her one of her precious author copies, and she says, I think she'll like my Eleanor. So all those fed into this imaginary story that I've created, where to explore the bond between Mrs. Knight and Jane Austen, and then my imaginary princess Eleanor, who comes in and disrupts Jane's world, and she's got to get to the bottom of it.
So amazing. And I love that you touched on all of that, and also the formidable women of the Knight family. It's definitely something that Caroline Jane Knight, who was on the podcast, who's Jane Austen's great niece,
I
spoke
listened
about
to it.
a
It's a
lot.
fabulous episode. I loved it. Granny, he wouldn't let anybody choose their own cakes. I mean, she is a knight, isn't she? She's a classic knight. She doesn't care if you want coffee or chocolate or Victoria sponge. You get what you're given in my house.
Exactly. And I just, there was actually something about when I was reading your book with Mrs. Knight that I was like, I really do feel the essence of the Knight women, because I'd spoken to Caroline and I was like, yes, it really holds true. And something that I love about that family as well is they do have these wonderful stories about the women in their lives, because often we don't have that captured. Like I just finished watching Miss Austen, the
Oh,
BBC
it's
adaptation of it.
beautiful.
Amazing, and really
Yeah,
does reflect Jill Hornby's book so well as well.
yeah, it's
But something that really
gorgeous.
stood out and really just hit me was the moment that Cassandra and Mary have, where Mary's just kind of like, well, who's going to tell our story? Who cares even? And I just think there's something in that, and I do think it's really wonderful that the Knights do have so many stories, and the real essence of the women in that family is really being upheld.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They're so. I mean, there's this just world of women around Austen that really supported her, and I think that we have to be so grateful for. And that I wanted to tell that story. I wanted to bring them to life as well as Jill Hornby's done so magically. And yeah, they deserve to be remembered, don't they?
100%. So another incredible character who's worth discussing is Princess Eleanor. So I'd love to know all about the inspiration for her. Wow, what a journey I went on with that character. But yeah, I'd love to talk about, how was Eleanor created? Is she based on real life people or a person? I'll let you
So,
chat about it.
Princess Eleanor is very much inspired by Princess Caraboo. So, in 1817, a young woman turned up in a Gloucester village claiming to be Princess Caraboo of the fictional island of Javasu. And she did things like she pretended not to recognize money or to know what a bed was. And she stuck peacock feathers in her hair, and she fashioned herself a pair of sandals, and she shot bow and arrows. And I think there's a wonderful story about her like shooting a pigeon and dressing it and eating it, and it like shocked everybody. And she managed to convince the magistrate and his wife to take her in, and her ruse lasted for about 2 months, in which she entertained all the local nobility and these like famous scholars of the new world that was being discovered at the time came to visit her, and verified that her language was consistent, the writing that she used was consistent, and had all these things in common with these like Indian Ocean languages that they were discovering at the time. So she got away with it for 2 months before she was discovered as a runaway servant called Mary Baker, the OG Anna Delvey, right? She was living her best life just as Princess Caraboo. And I think she's so fascinating. Firstly, because, what she did was at the time, there was this real interest in the different cultures that were just being discovered by Western explorers and things like Captain Cook's voyages. And so it's the same time as all those plates of the drawings of different native peoples kind of in costume and dancing were being circulated in magazines like the Ladies Magazine. So people had this real craze for the exotic, and what she did was she recognized that and she used it against them. And she wasn't really trying to swindle them out of any money. She was just kind of living her best life and enjoying this persona that she'd created. Um, and she was so clever and so creative, and she'd led like a really, really harsh life. So I think she was a cobbler's daughter, and she spent some time begging in London, and she'd had a child that she'd given up to the Foundling Hospital, who had died like really young. So she definitely suffered some serious trauma. Um, and what her former employers said about her was that she loved to tell stories. And it made me think, if Mary Baker had had the same support network that we've just talked about that Jane Austen had, so a privileged family, women who could support her, an education, would we remember her as another Jane Austen? Because I think she's just such a wonderful, creative person. And that isn't even the end of her story. So when she was discovered, her benefactress gave her some money to start again in America. She went over to America, and then she came back and she lived in Bristol, and ended up supplying leeches to the Bristol Royal Infirmary. So she started a business. She was a medical supplier, and she worked with her daughter, and she married. And there's a beautiful statue that's popped up a few years ago in tribute to her in Bristol. And she's such a legend, isn't she? Wonderful.
Oh my goodness, what a
So
story. What a life.
I know, what a life, what a life. So I was inspired by her and her story, and also what I wanted to do with this novel. So I think Sense and Sensibility, this is my tribute to Sense and Sensibility, and I think Sense and Sensibility is the darkest of Austen's novels. It's the most gothic in undertone, especially with the stories of Eliza the elder and Eliza Williams, her daughter. So they never really get resolved. Both of those women are kind of thrown to the wolves in that story. They both live very sad lives. And I really wanted to explore that darker side of Austen and explore trauma. And obviously Marianne goes through the huge trauma, and to understand the impacts of trauma. And it's quite personal for me as well, because part of the reason that I turned to Austen was after after being diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. So I needed some comfort in my life, and Austen provided that for me. So I really wanted to look at trauma, the effects on trauma, and say, like, we do survive as women, we survive some pretty horrific things, but what is the cost of that, and how does it affect us? And to place somebody who in many ways is the victim at the heart of her own story, and give her agency and make her present, rather than a kind of traditional crime novel, like as I did previously, where it starts and the woman is already dead and other things take over. So yeah, that was that
No,
that was the thought process that led me to Princess Elena.
I love all of that you've just said. And I really did feel that in this book. Something I wanted to discuss is how much you weave in the kind of dangers for women, whether that's like natural dangers in terms of like childbirth, because there weren't the same provisions back then, violence towards women, like that's touched on quite a lot, obviously sexual abuse, child loss and the pain that, you know, women go through in relation to that. And then like the other side of this, like in terms of mental illness, the risk of being committed, and the fear of witches that was obviously brewing, like you touch on that slightly, and the fear of just free thinking women uh,
Yeah,
is
yeah.
just rife. And what I loved is you really showed. I think you showed both that this doesn't have a bias, right? In this time period, it doesn't matter your age, it doesn't
Mm,
matter your fortune, you
mhm,
can still be at risk of, you know, all of these threats to women. And
mhm.
then on top of that, I feel like you also showed the way that in a generational sense you can start healing that, because all these different women come to support each other. So um yeah, I'd love to talk about that, the darker side of Austen, as you say.
Yeah, yeah, it's a really dark book, really. Although I hope I combine that with like the lightness and the wit. Um, but yeah, I think I was really interested in all the different ways that the patriarchy is out to get you in this time. Because you've got it, yeah, you've summed it up beautifully. You've got it coming at you from all angles. Um, and that's funny what you said about like the free thinking woman. So I'm reading Rebecca Romney's beautiful book at the moment about Jane Austen's bookshelf, and like there was this feeling at the time about like this fear of novels and that they might make young women kind of lazy, and um, there's this really funny
Praised.
quote. Yeah, there's this really funny quote from Fordyce, who obviously Jane Austen loved to hate. So Fordyce sermons is what Mary's reading in Pride and Prejudice, and um, or what Mr. Collins wants to read, and Lydia's like, "Oh God, this is so boring," and just starts talking over him. But in Fordyce's sermons, there's something like he says something like that these novels have the mark of the devil on them, and it just kind of sums up that, like, oh my god, it's just a novel, you know. Chill out. Just like women trying to think for themselves and comfort themselves and like explore what they're interested in. And yeah, he's like, oh, you know, these novels have the mark of the devil upon them. And it kind of it's the same discourse I see sometimes now about like spicy romance novels, and you know, people being, you know, like trying to censure what you read. I think it's really important that we're allowed to read what we want to, and think for ourselves. You know, if you don't like something, you don't have to read it, but don't try and police what other women want to read, or it's not your place.
100%. Not even just read, but do. This is something I feel
Yeah,
really passionately about. I think
yeah,
often we can fall into our own the trap of the patriarchy, in the sense that we start
yeah,
policing the system.
yeah,
So yeah,
yeah,
I do think there is something about supporting
yeah,
women who even
definitely.
want the opposite to you, right? They want to take
Yeah,
different paths in their lives, but
yeah,
that's the beauty.
yeah,
Now we have that choice, and
yeah.
we should celebrate it.
Definitely. So the thing about Sense and Sensibility is that whenever I read that novel or watch the beautiful Emma Thompson film, I'm always really disturbed at the end of it that there's not really a resolution for Eliza the Elder, as I said, or her daughter Eliza Williams, who is seduced by Willoughby, and ends up having his child. And I really loved the 2008 adaptation because Eliza is on screen. I know it's brilliant in every way, um, but I really like the way that they chose to put Eliza Williams on screen, and it makes you so much more aware of what a am I allowed to swear? What what a shit Willoughby is.
Yeah,
because because yeah, you see what he's done. He's like ruined that girl's life at the same time as he was messing with Marianne. So like the thing about the law in Georgian England, and we still have the hangover from its day, is that it's all based around protecting male property rights, and it's not focused on protecting vulnerable people like women. So the age of consent was only 12 then. It had been 12 since the Roman times. Um, there were people who were prosecuted for rape, but it was as today, like it's really, really, really hard to prove. And abducting and forcing someone into marriage was only a crime if you were an heiress, because really what you were doing was stealing like the fortune. Um,
Mm,
so in that book, Sense and Sensibility, um, Eliza the elder is forced to marry Colonel Brandon's elder brother, and she's an heiress. So by being forced into marriage, as if that isn't bad enough, what happens is that enables him to steal her fortune, because once she marries, all of her money and property passes to her husband. So in that one act, he's stolen everything from her, all her worldly goods. And then she's so unhappy with him, and then he ends up divorcing her. So as well as like stealing everything, he throws her to the wolves, and she ends up basically having to rely on prostitution to earn her living. And Colonel Brandon talks about going to see her in a sponging house at the end of her life, where the implication is she's dying from some terrible venereal disease. And he gives her his daughter to take care of. And then, talk about generational trauma, because, the same terrible story kind of repeats itself in that
yeah.
Eliza Williams, instead of being protected from all that as Brandon's ward, is meets Willoughby in Bath when she's a schoolgirl. I think she's 17. And is groomed and abducted and impregnated by him, and then abandoned by him. And it's so dark. And you get to the end of the book and it's like, oh, lovely, the Dashwood sisters get a happy ending. And I'm
Yeah.
like, what about
Yeah, what
Eliza?
about the women on the sidelines, like you said? Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
100%.
yeah. So I think Austen started writing it when she was quite young, and there's definitely the influences of the Gothic novels that she loved to read, which often explore kind of violence, especially sexual violence
Mm.
towards women. Um,
The Monk being a
so,
great example of that, which you
oh,
reference in the book. That is quite a difficult read. Like me and Martha read
yeah,
that one for the podcast, and it was
yeah.
dark for sure.
Yeah, yeah, I remember. Yeah, I had to find a way to slam the monk in there. Um, so so yeah, I wanted to kind of explore those themes in this novel. So yeah, it definitely is quite dark in places. But also I wanted to talk about the resilience of women, and what it takes to be resilient, and what you need, and the comforts that we can give each other, and the long history that women have of supporting each other through the darkest of times.
That is so beautiful. No, I love that. Yeah, like you said, the story of Eliza, both Elizas, is so tragic, and I actually appreciate that Austen gives them the same name, not just because obviously it's her mother's name, and there's obviously connotations back then that you kind of held onto your parents' names. But I think there's
Hmm.
something in it in general that they are kind of one and the same. You know what I mean?
Oh, you're so
Eliza
right.
represents so many women back then who would have suffered in that
Yeah,
way, and I just
yeah,
think it is such a dark story. Um, and there is no redemption for either
yeah.
of those
No,
characters. It's
no.
really
And
truly
and again, they're
heartbreaking.
off stage, so we never, like in the novel itself, we never hear from them. So yeah, again, like
Yeah.
what I wanted to do was to pull that woman who'd been through so much, and in many ways is broken, but also is surviving and making her own way and doing the best she can, right into center stage, and make her the focus of the book. And the other thing that I'm so glad you picked up on was like the medical risks at the time as well. So yeah, Nettie's wife, so they had a really happy marriage, right? But in like 15 years of marriage, she had 11 children. 11
My
children.
God.
I mean, I've got 2 children. That's exhausting enough, and was like enough of an impact on my like emotional, mental, and physical health.
Right.
11 children. And after the 11th child, it was about 2 weeks after, Elizabeth suddenly died. Um, and I just, the toll that having 11 children would take. And why do you carry on? Why do you carry on? Like, I think in one of Jane's own letters, she talks about one of their neighbours who's got like so many children. And she's like, I would recommend the simple regimen of separate bedrooms. because
Right.
because it's, like, and lovely to have like so many children if you can afford it. But in those days, like the risk to your health was so real. And when you look at medicine in those days and everything that doctors tried to do to help you was probably going to kill you. So
Right.
nothing, like, nothing helps. There's no antibiotics. The understanding of obstetrics was still really new. Everybody in Austen's novels is always being bled all the time, as if
Yeah.
that's going to help. So yeah, it was a really hard time, and it does feel like everything's kind of against you.
And the fear, I feel like there was a real sense of the fear around that as well. Like, it wasn't
Mm,
just for Elizabeth, her own anxieties about the fact that she was in your novels, obviously giving birth
yeah,
again. The other women constantly
yeah,
are just like, let's not stress her out. Let's make sure she's
yeah.
calm. And they have this fear um, between them that they're like,
Mm,
we're very concerned because we want to
yeah,
make sure she makes it through this.
yeah,
And that in itself is terrifying, right? Like I said,
yeah,
it's not necessarily the system itself out to get you. At the
yeah,
time, it was, the fact that there weren't
yeah.
these advances in medicine that you
Mm,
necessarily could always give birth safely. And even now, like sometimes I try not to be ignorant to the fact that there's so many of these threats that still exist all over the
mm.
world. Not everyone
Yeah,
can give birth
yeah, women,
safely.
yeah, women are still dying in childbirth, and like even now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, it's heartbreaking. Like women are dying in for the same kind of reasons that they were 200 plus years ago, and we have those medical advances. We could save those lives, but because of patriarchy, basically, women are suffering all over again, even in areas of the world where they really don't need to. So, yeah, I think we always have to remember the the fate of our great 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 grandmothers who came before us, because it's really easy if we're not careful for things to slip back. And as you say, like not
100%.
everywhere in the world has access. So in Afghanistan, like women, I was reading something yesterday, so they can't see a male physician, and they're not um allowed anymore to train as like midwives. So what do you do? What do you do in that situation? It's just heartbreaking, and it's really important to remember it, I think.
Yeah, 100%. I think so. Oh, it's just sent shivers down me. It is so
Mm,
true, though, isn't it? And like
mm,
you said, you made such a great point. It's not always just the physical aspect; it's that
mm,
emotional, turmoil that also having a child and giving birth can have as well.
mm.
I think you did a really good job of like representing. Obviously, we see the men how they react to the moment of like childbirth, and then you have Eliza running around the house like, oh my gosh, like got to help, got to make sure she makes it through this. And the stress, whereas they're just there like having a whiskey downstairs, like chilling.
Mm,
um
yeah.
and it is that difference, right? And
Mm.
it's almost, I think
What
this
is
is
it
just
she says in Persuasion? If there's anything disagreeable going on, men are sure to get out of it. Yeah.
right. Absolutely,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
it's um I
Yeah.
sometimes I just think like childbirth itself, I think just does, it's a manifestation of the true resilience of
Mm,
women, and I feel like it
mm,
is worth remembering. I think it's
mm.
just a reflection of um how women go through a lot of their lives, so strong, but
Yeah.
often it's almost expected. It's not necessarily always celebrated.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think it's definitely something that Jane Austen herself decided not to do. I mean, the evidence is there in the
Yeah.
letters, and you can imagine why. So, like you often had a female member of the family appointed to take care of you, and Cassandra did that kind of many times for Elizabeth. And I think Jane did whatever she did to get out of it, because she'd seen her sisters-in-law go through that. So not only Elizabeth, but Mary, and James's first wife, Anne. She'd seen what they'd suffered. And I know that Eliza, her cousin Eliza, who became her sister-in-law, records miscarriages after she was married to Henry.
Mm.
So Jane will have seen, the whole spectrum of childbirth, from the wonderful outcome to the very worst. And I think she definitely decided that that wasn't for her, that she was going to concentrate on writing, and her books were, her children, really. Yeah,
In
I think she
itself a form
definitely
of
thought,
creation. Yeah, that
yes,
they are her children,
yes,
exactly.
yes.
um
Unfortunately, we don't have to, well, some of us, unfortunately, don't have to make such a stark decision these days. But yeah, she definitely decided, nah.
wasn't for her, was not for her. I'd love to talk about then a bit more about the fact that this is like that tribute to Sense and Sensibility. But I also want to say that I just absolutely love about your books is even if it is a tribute to a specific novel, like one of the six novels, I really feel the essence of all of her works in there. Like you leave so many little breadcrumbs, and it's so subtle, but I just notice myself, my mind gets kind of drawn to other things like from Austen's text that I recognize. So that obviously there is the reference to books like Frances Burney's writing, The Monk, which Austen does herself. But even just like certain quotes that are in your books and the two Susans, right? The two maids that are called Susan. Um,
You got that?
yeah, honestly, I was giggling. I put a note, like I said, I made all my notes at the front, crying about the two Susans.
Oh, I'm so glad you got that because I thought, because I write these books as like a joke to myself, and a way for me to spend time in Austen's world and, like crack myself up with these little references. So it's so exciting when other people kind of get what I was talking about. So yeah, I felt I had to include the two seasons because what I'd done in the first Miss Austen Investigates is that so Northanger Abbey was called Susan originally, right? But I've called it Catherine
Yeah.
in the first Miss Austen Investigates because she's writing Lady Susan, and I wanted people to know that I was referring to Catherine Morland rather than like some other Susan. So then I felt guilty that I'd rewritten Susan as Catherine. So I was like, all right, how am I going to get this Susan back in there? So yeah, we get the two Susans.
I felt all the essence of that. Don't you worry, that was not lost on me. But that is the point, right? I feel like obviously your book is beautiful and accessible to anyone, even people who I would say not even familiar with Austen could read this and love the series for what it is in its own right. But I feel like there is that resonance with people when you know that you equally have that love of Jane Austen and you can pick up on all these nuances and these breadcrumbs that you've left behind. And I can imagine that is really satisfying when you hear someone say, I got that. I love that.
So I think my copy editor or whoever was like, why do they have to both be called Susan? This is really confusing. It's like, because there are two seasons, because there's Lady Susan and there's Susan. And it's really weird because like most of her characters are named after real people in her life. Like it's the same kind of like 5 names for girls and 5 names for boys throughout the Georgian era, which is really, really confusing. But then she suddenly has Lady Susan and Susan, and I can't find any Susans in the Austen like family.
It's quite
And that
an
was the
unusual
other,
name. I don't think I've come
yeah,
across it much in
yeah,
general.
yeah. That was the other funny thing about this book is that everyone is called Elizabeth or Edward. So I had to get really creative with like Neddy, Brooke, Ted.
Yeah, because everyone's got the same name.
Everyone's got the same name, and everyone is like Mr. Austen, Captain Austen, Lieutenant Austen. It's like, oh my God, can we please just have a different name? But yeah, so yeah. So what I really, really like, my ambition really is that you could pick this book up if you are just a kind of murder mystery fan, and perhaps it will intrigue you about Austen and her world, and perhaps because of that you might watch an adaptation and maybe read the original text for yourself and get an understanding of who she is. And at the other end of the spectrum, if you're like me and you and you've read everything and you've watched everything, you will spot all those little breadcrumbs. But I want it to be kind of accessible from both sides of the coin, really. And I don't want to alienate anyone. And what I really, really hope is that I'll encourage a few new Austen fans with it.
I love that, right? I absolutely, and I personally think you've captured it beautifully, being on one end of the spectrum of it. Um, but yeah, I think so. I think, and also what a lovely desire to have as a writer. You know what I mean? Like somebody who is capturing Austen, but then equally, you're like, I hope I can bring people into the world of Austen. I think that's what we all want in when we create things from like the base of like the fandom or just like Jane Austen's universe. It is that sense of, you know, I hope I can bring more people into her original text. It's less about in some ways it's less about kind of your own success in that world and more just like I hope this will be
Yeah.
a path to Austen's work
Yeah.
herself.
Yeah. You just want to share that love, share that enthusiasm.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that
Yeah.
so much.
And I can't help referencing all of it. And I can't help, like, I'll be writing something and then I'll realise what I've done,
It must be
like, and
such
I
a
don't
joke with
mean to.
yourself. Like
Yeah.
because like I was cracking up about the two Susans, but I'm like, it must be so fun sometimes just writing stuff, and it's almost like you can embody the wit of Austen just in that conversation that you're technically having with her in writing
Yeah,
this.
absolutely, absolutely. That's exactly how it started. It was a way to have a conversation with Austen herself about her work. Yeah.
Yeah, I love. So actually, on that note, then I'd love to talk about your writing process in general. I've become super fascinated about writing processes. I watched I watched this whole video about like Stephen King's process and how he essentially he kind of lets his characters and his plots write themselves. So he just
Oh
starts and
yeah.
he writes every day and he just lets it unfold.
Okay.
Which I would like to think that I was enough free flowing to be able to do that, but I actually think I want too much control over the
Yeah.
story that I think I'd really struggle to write in that way. But I was like, I really would love to know your writing process. Like, how do
Yeah.
you create your worlds?
So I'm exactly the opposite from Stephen King. I'm very like, I'm so Miss Austen Investigates is the first book that I published, but it's not the first book that I'd written. And I tried like different ways before, like that free flowing technique. And I hadn't, well, I had like some success, but I hadn't managed to get published. And then Miss Austen Investigates was the first book that I'd really sat down with a structure and planned. Um, and it got published, and it's been really successful, and it's now published in 18 territories around the world, which is just so exciting. I found the audiobook of it in Italian on Audible the other day and just listened to the beginning and was like, oh my god, it's my words but in Italian. So I'm now obviously I'm staying with that formula. So I can't deviate from it. It's working. So I do a couple of different things. So the first thing I do is I plan the whole novel from start to finish. And to do that, I think about the journey of the character. So I make sure that I've got a character arc for Jane in each of them. So this one, because it's a tribute to Sense and Sensibility, her character arc was very similar to Eleanor in Eleanor Dashwood, in that, she starts off thinking that she can manage this situation, save her brother's inheritance, and save or like find out the problem with the princess, all by herself. And as she goes through the book, she learns that she really needs the help of others as well as her own resilience in order to do that. Um, so I have that character journey to start with, and then I do something called an inside outline. And if you Google this, you can find the template for it online. So it's I can't remember the name of the organisation. Um, but yeah, if you search for writing plan inside outline. So what I do is I plan every scene with just a bullet point, and I say what's going on the surface, and then I'll say what's going on in Jane's mind. So I'll have like two columns, a bullet point on either side. So in this one, Jane is going on a picnic um, with like her family and this suitor that Elizabeth is trying to set her up with. But in Jane's mind, she's there to interrogate the doctor on what he thinks might be causing Elena to act so strangely. And I plan that all the way through so that I've got a summary of the kind of the scene or the chapter, the action, and then what's going on inside. Because I think with mystery, it is quite complicated, in that you're telling a story about another story. You're telling a story where someone's trying to find out the truth of another story. So I love having it like on a few pieces of paper. Um, the author accelerator, that's what it's called. The author accelerator inside outline. So they say you should do it over 4 pages. Mine are like 25, 30 pages long. But it means that like when I'm looking at when she's understanding clues, I can know when she knows something and I can move that around really easily. And then I also love Save the Cat as well. So there's a book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel, by another Jessica, whose surname I can't remember. And that talks about kind of story structure in, like you start off and you have your inciting incident, and then you have your midpoint, and then you'll have your kind of like Dark Night of the Soul and your finale. And she uses, my favorite bit of that book is that she uses, and she talks about like a universal structure that all good stories have, and she breaks down persuasion into that story structure. I know, and obviously I loved that bit, like, looking at Persuasion as a classic story that follows all these beats. So yeah, I love planning. I know that a lot of authors don't, but I really love it. And I think that and I'm constantly trying to immerse myself in Jane Austen's world by looking at, the history books of the time, the family's writing, her writings, rereading her works, um, so that with my characters, when I kind of get to a point in the story where, so for example, where Jane's going on that picnic and she wants to interrogate the doctor, but she knows it's a setup, I know how she's going to behave because I've spent so much time kind of with her and Neddy, that I know how they would react in that scenario. It's really weird. So the characters do a bit of talking to me, but also I'm really rigorous in my planning and I find it really fun and really exciting. And it's really helpful when I edit that I have that plan there because I can refer back to it, and make notes for myself.
I suppose the benefit as well, with yours being so tied to historical figures and like historical events as well, there is the benefit that you can kind of weave in things that did happen, or like
Mm,
moments, and you can kind of build from there as
mm.
well. Because I feel like otherwise it would, I don't think you'd be able to capture the balance as well as you do without that planning process where you can kind of place everything.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I know that, there'll be like some true events that I want to like put in there. And yeah, I can map them all out and know when we're going to refer to them. Yeah.
I love that. It's so exciting.
Yeah.
Honestly, I'm so fascinated by how people write things. It's so funny. I remember I had such a moment when I was talking to Tom Ailing about Austen's writing process and how she kind of pins these edits onto the pages. And I was like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh, I was so excited because I was like, oh, that's how I write. Like if I'm writing an essay,
Yeah.
I'll print it
Yeah.
out and then I'll like, well, I won't pin it, but I'll like stick with glue just like on
Yeah.
top, like I'm changing
Yeah.
that to this because I need to be able to like visualize it. So
Yeah.
I was like so excited. I was like, oh, I just feel so connected to Austen right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But I love hearing about other people's writing processes because I think it is fascinating. But I also know there's a lot of people who listen to the podcast who are aspiring writers, people who just
Yeah.
love to write in general, people who are trying to get published. So I think it's great sometimes to hear about how different people do the process. And I also love is you always you acknowledge your whole journey. You know what I mean? This isn't just you wrote a book and it's like I was published, and you say the about how, especially in the first episode that
Yeah.
we did together, which I recommend people going back and listening to that one as well. But that it's not always this simple process, right? It
No.
takes time
It's
sometimes.
very rarely a simple process. And, Austen, reading about how hard it was for Austen and how hard she worked, really inspires me. Um, and yeah, you're saying about her editing process. So I love that as well. So what I tend to do is I try and write my first draft fairly quick, and then I go over it and over it and over it so that I can draw out the themes, and then do the research that I need to do in order to make it stack up historically. And that's something that I really recommend as well. And I think it's something that Austen did. So I'm reading Sanditon at the moment. I left it till last because I didn't want to read the last thing because I would just cry. But I think you can really tell in Sanditon that it's a first draft, and it's like, she's getting down the action of the story. And it's almost, it doesn't sound like her voice. And then suddenly you'll come across a sentence that is so Austen and so witty. It just takes your breath away. And yeah, it's really lovely to see. I mean, it's gutting that we don't have a finished novel of Sanditon, but it's really lovely because we don't have the early manuscripts for a lot of them. It's really wonderful to see how she honed and crafted those novels over so many years, and they're the beautiful finished products that they are. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, amazing. Um, Another thing I want to touch on before we wrap up today is if you can even chat about this, is like what's next? Can you say anything about what's next? I know for a lot of people listening, I mean, I'm trying to think when this is going to come out in relation. It might be that people still need to pre-order the book,
Yeah.
but when this
Yeah.
episode comes out. But yeah, do you
So
have
this is
plans?
the book is out. The book is out in the US on the 25th of March and in the UK in the 27th of March.
With this
So
episode will be out before then.
amazing. So please, please, please pre-order the book. I'd love it if you pre-ordered the book. It means the world to authors. Yeah, please pre-order it if you're interested. And then I can't say much, but I can say more Jane. More Jane.
Very
There's going to be
exciting.
a whole lot more Jane from me. And yeah, I'm so excited that I'm going to get the opportunity to do that in a year of Jane. It's just wonderful. And basically, my ambition this year is to meet as many fellow Janeites as possible and to convert as many Janeites as possible. Join our crew. um, so yeah, I'll be doing lots of events kind of up and down the UK. And yeah, really, really hope to meet some of your listeners at those.
I hope we'll meet in person this year. I'm hopeful
Yes,
we probably
yes,
will. Uh,
yes, yes,
we've
yes,
got to cross
yes,
paths, right? And if not,
yes.
we'll have
See,
to
yes,
orchestrate it.
yes, yes, yes. So yeah, I hope to see you at one of Laughing with Lizzie's balls, or in Bath in September. And I was saying how before we came on that I really hope that you're addicted as I am to dressing up in Regency now because you look so adorable. In the pictures last year, you look so cute.
Oh,
I have to see you in your bonnet one day soon.
I know. It was just such a magical experience. So I'm excited for more of that this year. And the wonderful Abby, who's laughing with Lizzie's best friend.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's making me another dress.
Is
So
she?
she
So she doesn't
is.
make them for everyone, does she? She doesn't. She
I don't
doesn't.
I don't know.
Yeah,
I
you.
know
Yeah.
she makes for
Mm,
herself and she does make for
mm,
Sophie. So a lot of Sophie's wardrobe
yeah.
Abby is made, as well
Yeah.
as other people, because Sophie's wardrobe
Yeah.
is mahoosive when it comes to Regency attire.
Yeah.
But yeah, Abby's so busy with workshops,
Yeah.
which she does have one for those listening happening at Chatsworth House in the summer. So do check that out as well. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure
Yeah.
yet.
Because
Maybe
I
I can
brought.
tell people that I'm
So
my
Abby does
secret.
these beautiful embroidery kits, and I've bought a few of them from her in the past because I love sewing. And my 16-year-old daughter is into embroidery. Um, not unfortunately not Regency embroidery. So her latest project is embroidering some Converse with, like, I don't know, goth heads or something, skeletons.
Love that
But
for her.
I know. I've offered to pay her to embroider me a reticule, but she's like, too busy, mum. Yeah, she's very sweet. And she loves those kits that Abby does. Yeah, and I DM'd Abby last time, like, oh wow, I love this dress that you made. Any chance? But no, I think you're on the VIP list there. And yeah, good for you. I want to see the next one.
I'm so excited. Yeah, both Avi and Sophie have been, yeah, just so wonderful in my journey with Austen. I really do owe them both a lot. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm
And
so
if
excited as well.
anyone's thinking of trying out a Austen event, then those balls that they arrange and those workshops are so friendly and so welcoming, and so easy in terms of the Regency dancing that even I can do it. So yeah, they're a really good place to start, I think.
And you will be seeing me at one of them this year,
Amazing.
100%, if not multiple. So 100%.
Amazing.
Very
Amazing.
excited.
And hopefully in Bath. And I really, really,
Yes.
really want to go to Chatsworth. I really want to go to that one.
Me too. That looks so exciting, right? They're like summer thing. I've booked
Yeah.
the screening of Pride and Prejudice on the Friday.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I'm going to be there for the cinema
Amazing.
thing, but hopefully some of the other
Oh,
events. It's the weekend before my birthday, actually. So,
oh,
and it's my Charlotte Lucas birthday this year. So
yay! I look forward to seeing your cake. Got to get a Charlotte Lucas
I've got to
cake.
get a cake, right? I've got to. I've got
What a
to.
year. What a year to
I
officially
know.
in spinsterhood.
I know. What can I say? The year of Austen, and I'm officially a spinster as well. It's wonderful. It's great.
Good for you. Good for you.
Oh, but it's been such a pleasure. Oh, pleasure. It's been such a pleasure just having you on the podcast. As always. Do you want to let everyone know where they can find you? And obviously, like you said, they can pre-order the book now.
Yes.
This is
So
it.
I'm mainly on Instagram now. I don't really go on the site that shall not be named anymore. And I think my yeah, so I'm on Instagram as Jessica Ball Novelist. And I've lost you now. Where are you? And I'm on Blue Sky. And I have a website at jessicaballauthor.com. So yeah, I'd love to hang out with you on one of those sites. And A Fortune Most Fatal is out in hardback in the UK on the 25th of March, and you can pre-order it at Waterstones or Amazon or your local indie. And in the USA on the 25th of March, and again it's Barnes and Noble or Amazon, and many other countries around the world later on in the year. And yeah, I'd love to know what you think about it.
Well, congratulations, Jess. It's a wonderful book. And I'm so excited for you and this year and for everyone else to read it. Please do drop us a message if you do. I'd love to hear your thoughts, or in the comment section on YouTube, or there's now like this section on Spotify where you can add your thoughts as well. I read all of them. So please do leave your thoughts and ideas and anything if you just want to send a message or a message for Jess. I'll make sure that she gets it. So yeah, but that is everything from us today. And I will see you in another episode.
Amazing. Thank you so much for having me.